Everyone agreed that Ethan Hale was a good man. Not loudly good, not performative, just dependable. He paid bills on time. He remembered anniversaries. He listened when his wife Claire talked, or at least he believed he did. Their marriage wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode or collapse. It simply settled into routine, the way dust settles in a quiet room. Ethan told himself this was normal. This was adulthood. This was stability. But somewhere inside him a small, uncomfortable thought began to grow. Is this it? He didn't say it out loud. He didn't even admit it to himself fully. But the silence between him and Claire began to feel heavier than any argument ever could. And that was when the whispers found him. Her name was Lena. She didn't flirt. She didn't touch him. She didn't even say anything inappropriate. She just listened. When Ethan spoke to her, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Seen. Not as a husband, not as a provider, but as a man with thoughts, doubts, and unspoken frustrations. Lena asked questions Claire no longer did. How do you feel about your life? Do you ever feel trapped by expectations? Each question felt harmless, safe. Ethan began answering honestly, and that honesty felt intoxicating. He told himself nothing was wrong. No lines had been crossed. No vows broken. But that night, lying next to Claire, he noticed something terrifying. Her breathing annoyed him. And that's when the guilt first appeared, not as regret, but as justification. It's not cheating if it's only words, he thought. It's not betrayal if nothing physical has happened. The whisper returned, softer this time. You deserve to be understood. Ethan didn't decide to lie. That was how he justified it. The first lie was small. A delayed meeting. A longer route home. Claire noticed, of course. She always noticed. You've been distant, she said one evening, not accusing, just tired. Ethan felt irritation flare up before guilt could stop it. I'm just stressed, he replied. Work's been heavy. That was true. Just not the whole truth. Because work wasn't what drained him. It was the constant comparison. With Claire, conversations were practical, predictable, familiar. With Lena, every word felt deliberate, like it mattered. Lena never criticized Claire directly. She didn't need to. She'd say things like, some people grow together, others just grow around each other. Ethan would nod. He would fill in the rest himself. At each time he did, the lies felt less like deception and more like self-preservation. Something strange began to happen to Ethan's memories. He remembered his early marriage differently now. Moments that were once warm started to feel dull in hindsight. Arguments he'd brushed off now felt suffocating. Silences that were once comfortable now felt like neglect. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. But every time he spoke to Lena, the past shifted just a little. You gave a lot, she said once. Did anyone ever ask what you wanted? The question lingered long after the conversation ended. Ethan began telling himself a new story, that he had been patient, that he had compromised, that he had been quietly unhappy for years. The frightening part wasn't that he believed it. It was that it felt true. One night, Claire reached for his hand in bed. Ethan hesitated, just for a second. She noticed. And in that hesitation, something between them fractured. Not loudly, not completely, but enough that it would never fit the same way again. Somewhere else, a whisper smiled. Claire tried to fix things. That was always her instinct. She suggested date nights, short trips, even counseling, softly, gently, without pressure. Ethan smiled and agreed, but inside, something twisted. Every attempt felt like another chain, another reminder of the life he was supposed to be grateful for. Lena never asked him to fix anything. She never asked him to explain himself. She never asked him to promise anything. With her, there were no expectations, only possibility. One evening, while Claire cooked dinner, Ethan scrolled through old photos on his phone. Birthdays, anniversaries, quiet Sundays. They looked like someone else's memories. He realized something that frightened him. He didn't feel nostalgic. He felt trapped. And instead of confronting that fear, he let it turn into resentment. Resentment is easier than guilt. Resentment feels justified. The first time Ethan imagined leaving, it wasn't dramatic. There was no plan, no suitcase, no shouting. Just a quiet thought while sitting in his car. What if I didn't go home tonight? The idea felt like oxygen. He didn't act on it. He went home. He ate dinner. He listened to Claire talk about her day. But something had changed. Now he knew the door existed. Lena didn't push him. She didn't need to. All she said once was, "Sometimes people stay loyal to a version of their life that no longer exists." That night, lying beside Claire, Ethan stared at the ceiling. He wasn't thinking about love anymore. He wasn't thinking about guilt. He was thinking about freedom. And freedom, once imagined, becomes hunger. Ethan began noticing how easily he could hurt Claire. Not physically, not loudly, just emotionally. A delayed response, a distracted nod, a sigh that said "you're exhausting" without using words. Claire felt it immediately. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked one night. The question annoyed him, not because it was unfair, but because it interrupted his peace. "No," he said, "you're imagining things." And for the first time, he watched her doubt herself. Something inside him recoiled. Something else leaned in closer. Lena, on the other hand, never questioned him. When he spoke, she listened. When he hesitated, she waited. Ethan began to associate Claire with discomfort and Lena with relief. That association hardened. People don't leave relationships because they hate someone. They leave because being kind becomes tiring. And Ethan was very, very tired. Ethan didn't think of himself as a bad man. Bad men were impulsive, violent, careless. He was none of those things. He was careful. He began framing his thoughts in logic. Claire would survive without me. We're not happy. She just doesn't realize it yet. Staying would only make things worse. These weren't emotional thoughts. They were efficient ones. Lena never challenged them. She didn't have to. She simply said things like, "Some people confuse endurance with love." That sentence settled into Ethan's mind like a verdict. One evening, he looked at Claire across the dinner table and felt nothing. No anger, no affection, no regret, just distance. And in that emotional vacuum, a terrifying realization took shape. If he felt nothing, then nothing he did could really be wrong. That was the moment the man Claire married quietly disappeared. What remained was something calmer, colder, more decisive. Ethan began rehearsing conversations that never happened. Not arguments, not confessions, explanations. He practiced them silently while driving, while showering, while lying beside Claire at night. He imagined telling people that things had simply ended, that the marriage had been hollow for years, that staying would have been dishonest. In these rehearsals, he was calm, reasonable, sympathetic. The frightening part was how natural it felt. Claire noticed the distance growing wider, but when she tried to step closer, Ethan felt something close to panic. Not fear of losing her, fear of being pulled back. One evening, she said softly, "I miss you, even when you're here." Ethan nodded. He didn't say "I'm sorry." He didn't say "I love you." He said nothing at all. And in that silence, he felt a strange relief, as if he had already left. Ethan stopped thinking in terms of right and wrong. Those words felt childish now. Instead, he thought in terms of necessary changes, necessary pain, necessary endings. Lena didn't tell him what to do. She only said once, quietly, "Sometimes the kindest thing is to stop pretending." Ethan took that sentence apart later, piece by piece. Pretending implied dishonesty. Stopping implied courage. Kindest implied morality. It was the perfect justification, gentle, vague, impossible to argue with. That night, Ethan stood in the doorway of his bedroom and watched Claire sleep. He didn't feel hatred. He didn't feel love. He felt certainty. And certainty, once achieved, is more dangerous than rage. Because rage fades. Certainty acts. The house felt different afterward. Not quieter. Not louder. Just wrong. Ethan noticed small things first. Claire's mug still on the counter. Her shoes by the door. The faint impression of her presence in rooms she no longer occupied. He told people what he had practiced, that things had fallen apart, that it had been complicated, that sometimes love simply ends. People nodded. They offered sympathy. They told him he looked tired. No one questioned the calm in his voice. At night, Ethan sat alone in the living room and waited for something to happen inside him. Grief, relief, regret. None of it came. Instead, there was only an expanding emptiness, like a room with no walls. And for the first time, a question surfaced that Lena had never prepared him for. If this was freedom, why did it feel so heavy? Lena didn't disappear immediately. She was there, attentive, patient, reassuring. But something had shifted. The intensity that once fueled their connection began to thin, stretched by reality. Ethan noticed it in pauses between messages, in conversations that ended sooner than they used to, in the absence of urgency. The whispers faded, not because Ethan no longer needed them, but because the damage had already been done. One evening, sitting alone in the house that still smelled faintly like Claire, Ethan realized the truth. Lena hadn't taken anything from him. She had simply made it easier for him to take it from himself. And now there was nothing left to justify. No marriage. No illusion of righteousness. No voice guiding him forward. Only a man sitting with the consequences of his own certainty. And certainty, once acted upon, offers no comfort in return. Guilt didn't arrive the way Ethan expected. It wasn't loud. It didn't accuse him. It simply occupied space. It sat in empty chairs. It lingered in rooms he avoided. It followed him into sleep and waited for him when he woke up. People stopped checking in as often. Life moved forward, just not with him. Ethan realized something unsettling. The world hadn't noticed what he'd done. There was no reckoning. No dramatic collapse. Just days that continued, indifferent to his choices. And in that indifference, guilt sharpened. Because if no one punished him, then whatever pain he felt had to come from inside. One morning, Ethan caught his reflection by accident. Not in passing, really looked. The man staring back didn't seem evil. He didn't even seem broken. He looked empty. That frightened him more than rage ever could have. He tried to remember the last time he'd laughed without effort. The last time he'd felt warmth without calculation. Nothing came. Ethan understood then that obsession doesn't end when you get what you want. It ends when there's nothing left to want. And the worst punishment wasn't loneliness. It was knowing that no one had forced him to become this person. He had listened. He had agreed. He had chosen. And now the man in the mirror was the only witness left. Ethan stopped expecting messages from anyone. Days passed where the only sound in the house was the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, his own footsteps moving from room to room with no purpose attached. He had imagined silence as peace. But silence, he learned, can be accusatory. It leaves space for thoughts to echo, and his thoughts had nowhere else to go. He tried to remember the man he had been before the whispers. The husband who believed stability was enough. The man who thought dissatisfaction was temporary. That version of himself felt fictional now, like a character he once played convincingly. Ethan realized something chilling. He hadn't destroyed his life in a moment. He had dismantled it carefully, piece by piece, and called it honesty. There was no audience anymore, no wife to deceive, no lover to impress, no future to rehearse explanations for. Ethan noticed how often he still argued, internally, defending himself, justifying choices. But there was no one listening. And slowly, the arguments faded. Without resistance, the excuses collapsed under their own weight. One night, sitting alone in the dark, Ethan finally allowed the thought he had avoided since the beginning. If I had never listened, nothing would have needed explaining. The realization didn't save him. It didn't punish him either. It simply settled in, permanent and immovable, because the cruelest truth wasn't that he had been tempted. It was that, in the end, he had agreed. Ethan stopped thinking about Lena. Not deliberately, not angrily. She simply faded. Her voice no longer echoed in his thoughts. Her questions no longer guided his decisions. What remained was something far heavier. Responsibility, not legal, not public, personal. Ethan understood now that temptation hadn't ruined him. Opportunity hadn't ruined him. He had ruined himself by choosing comfort over conscience again and again until conscience stopped speaking. The whispers hadn't been commands. They had been invitations, and he had accepted every one. Ethan lived. That was the cruelest part. He woke up. He went to work. He paid bills. He existed. Nothing dramatic marked the end of his story. No punishment arrived to balance the scale. No moment of clarity erased the past. He simply carried it. Every day. The life he fought for felt hollow, like a prize that lost its value the moment it was claimed. Freedom, he learned too late, isn't the absence of obligation. It's the ability to live with what you choose. And some choices poison that ability forever. One night, sitting alone in the dark, Ethan waited for guilt to scream, for memory to accuse, for the whispers to return. Nothing came, and that was the final cruelty, because silence doesn't argue. It doesn't forgive, doesn't forget. It just stays. Ethan understood then that the whispers had never been external at all. They were his own thoughts, given permission, nurtured, obeyed. And now that they had done their work, they no longer needed to speak. Years later, no one would remember the details. People would forget the marriage, forget the explanations, forget the woman who once shared his life. Ethan would be remembered as ordinary, and that was the final truth of it. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like people who listened and decided that what they wanted mattered more than what they were. And once that decision is made, nothing ever whispers again.